Okay, take three. Hi, everyone. Apparently, I hit something on my phone and made it impossible for me to see myself, which made me wonder whether I was recording at all. And it's helpful when I can see myself on the camera to know that I am recording. So, thank you for your patience. So, this is part 5 of the series that apparently has just evolved organically, called The Ups and Downs of Healing. And today I want to talk about some of the unconscious ways that post-traumatic stress is affecting not just our health, but also our life as a whole. And I want to say hello to those of you who are joining me. The common definition of post-traumatic stress is that it's an anxiety-related chemical reaction in the brain or with the hormones that lingers after an extremely stressful experience, such as a sexual attack or physical violence or military combat, or just some of the very common ways that we tend to associate post-traumatic stress with. But in truth, stressful, scary, and painful memories of past experiences, even ones that seem so insignificant to us as human beings, can leave an imprint that can be triggered at any time, even in the absence of danger. The intensity of the trigger reaction can be an indication of where and when you are in that moment. And what I mean by that is that many times when we're experiencing a trigger, it doesn't have anything to do with what's going on in our physical reality in the moment. And it can feel as if the reaction is displaced. You know, you can, for example, be experiencing a fight or flight response sitting in your living room, and there's nothing that's happening that would warrant the reaction that you're having, because in the moment you are someplace else. You're either someplace in the past, something that's happened in your experience in the past, or even farther back in a past life experience. It can also be related to something that you absorbed while you were in the womb that related to your parents, or something that's connected to ancestral lineage. So it can be very confusing when those triggers fire as to what's really going on, and it can be very disconcerting. What was interesting for me as I was gathering some of my thoughts together and putting down some notes, it really put me in touch with some of the, that could be PTSD triggers for myself. For example, I love seeing my acupuncturist, and she is so skillful. And there have been 2 instances over the last 4 years where she'll put it on a particular point, and when it grabs, it sends like this energy through every one of my fingers, kind of like when you hit a funny bone. It's not painful, but every time she goes into doing one of those trigger points, or rather those acupuncture points, I can feel myself starting to brace, as if I'm going to have that same experience, because it feels really creepy. And of course, I've told her this, and it's only happened twice in 4 years. But what's interesting is how that memory can be held in our body and in our consciousness, and we don't even think about that because it seems, as I said, so insignificant. We can experience and perceive stress and trauma individually and collectively, and it can occur from any life experience that we experience as difficulty. And once that experience has passed, we can easily forget it, but it lingers and leaves an imprint in our brain, in our body, and without realizing it, we can be layering experiences one on top of another until it becomes an even more intense trigger. So I want to get a little bit more specific with you. Irrational fears or health issues can be traced to residual energy from a past life or lives, and the intensity of the trigger can be an indication of what's going on at that time that may not make sense to your human brain. One of my very good friends, who I've worked with many times in doing past life regressions, has memories of smelling gas. And when we did a past life, she was able to connect with being one of the women who was gassed in the Holocaust. She can at times still smell the gas. And we've done a number of healing sessions to help to liberate her from that post-traumatic experience. And interestingly, one of the things that she deals with is asthma. And that was an indication of taking a look at what might be connected to a past life, because asthma has to do with difficulty breathing. Another time when I was working with somebody who was dealing with a breathing experience, we traced it back to a lifetime in which that person had an accident and was actually buried alive, and was suffocating under an avalanche. And while it made no sense to that person, because it was not something that was experienced in this lifetime, once we were able to track it back. And there's ways that you can work with a past life regression to rewrite the story or help that person to release that energy at that level. And it can have a cascade effect, like a house of cards, that will benefit that person in this current life. So I always keep a question when I'm working with people and doing inner healing work, dealing any kind of trauma work with them, to keep the possibility of a past life connection, because it's kind of like a tapestry of things that have an interrelation. And I'll say more about that as well. Inner child wounds also can be a place where we're looking at post-traumatic stress. It can come up with feeling abandoned or neglected as a child, being bullied. I'll give you an example of one of the ways that it became a trigger for me. When I was growing up, and I know that this is probably very surprising to some of you who see me as an extrovert, but I can actually be very introverted. And when I was growing up, I was a very shy child. I also grew up with a very Jewish nose. And if you're not familiar with what that means, is I had a hook nose. And I was very uncomfortable with that. You know, children can be very cruel. I was teased a lot. I was called a lot of names. And so my self-esteem growing up was not very strong. And in addition to that, I had a stutter, which from time to time comes up when too many thoughts jam in my brain. So as I was able to get a nose job when I was 18, I had to do that for my own self-esteem, because I was not feeling pretty, I was not feeling empowered, and that really for me was very, very traumatic. And of course, the whole process of getting a nose job in itself is traumatic, because of what that experience is in order for that surgery to occur. I don't think I'm still holding on to things from that. So years later, when I found myself working as an addictions counselor and I was being called to be speaking in front of larger audiences, I could feel that panic coming up, the old stutter. And as I found myself in front of large audiences, and actually the idea of even doing videos was terrifying for me. And I know that fear of public speaking is very traumatic for a lot of people. What I also tracked back, and for those of you listening, this may also be something that you relate to. In past lives, many of us who are here in this life now and being called to be more visible were killed for speaking our truth. I know a number of lifetimes that I was killed in a lot of different ways. Past lives are very real for me, whether you call it concurrent lives or different timelines. Timelines. If the being visible is scary for you in expressing yourself, or even showing up in ways like doing a video, it can be traced back to old post-traumatic stress that is lingering from past lives, or even in this life when you felt ridiculed, when you didn't feel heard or felt loved or supported. It can be related to not feeling as if your voice is welcome. And what happens, one of the points that I want to make here is that when we have a lot of these traumas that don't get resolved, they kind of layer on top of each other, and they become more intense. It's something that I said a few minutes ago, and I want to reiterate that. So experiences that create the not good enough wound can affect self-care and self-punishment and putting your health and safety at risk. If you've had trauma in your life, like sexual abuse, I worked with a lot of survivors when I was an addictions counselor, and self-neglect and hurting themselves and putting themselves in danger was a very common reaction to the trauma that they experienced. And so that was part of the work that we did, was helping them to restore more self-love, more self-esteem, to find their voice, to help them to have different avenues that they could reclaim their power, setting boundaries so that they could turn that feeling of being victimized and powerlessness into a way to show up for themselves. And of course, it played out in their health as well, through some of the things that they were doing in terms of alcoholism and really putting their health at risk over and over again. And it was incredible to see how they could turn their lives around when we were able to get to some of those deeper places and some of those trigger points. Here's a third way. I'm probably not doing it in terms of 1, 2, and 3, but I just want to give you some frameworks of things to think about that might be relevant in your own life where you have some questions. I see a lot of you are joining me, some new people, so thank you. So health triggers, those seem to be really common ways that we can connect with post-traumatic stress. Here are some subtle ways as well. If you've had a lingering or a chronic illness, chronic pain, disease diagnosis, or any kind of a life scare like recovering from cancer, one of the things that we deal with is fear of having a recurrence. And it's not unusual, for example, with a cancer diagnosis. I've experienced this myself, having been diagnosed 4 times. And I know that as I have worked with different people who are dealing with health challenges, especially ones that have become chronic or a cancer diagnosis, there is this concern about what if it comes back, and I don't want it to come back. The whole process of dealing with a cancer diagnosis is and can be very, very traumatic. I was working with a woman last year who was dealing with a stage 3 or a stage 4, I don't recall exactly, and we tracked it back to a past life in which she died from cancer. And I think we went back about 300 years. And of course, during those times, the way in which healing and health was dealt with is very different than the way we're dealing with it now. And so we were able to work with it at that time, in that particular timeline, and change some of that, the way in which that life came to an end, because we can do things like that. We can work with the energy a little bit differently and rewrite stories and endings, which you may not know that we can do that. And so here she is in this current life dealing with a breast cancer diagnosis, and one of the things that she's working with, again, is this fear of it recurring. And since that is not uncommon in the community of people dealing with a disease diagnosis, there is some PTSD that she's dealing with that. Another close friend of mine was in a very severe accident last year. How she walked away from that is astonishing. And in the course of the year, I did about 16 sessions with her, because part of obviously walking away from a situation like that, where you were rear-ended by somebody who was texting going 45 miles an hour and hitting you, rear-ending you, and actually walking away and not being killed, leaves a lot of imprints. And so there's been a lot of trauma that resulted from that. And while it's obvious, you would think when you've survived an accident like that, it also plays out in a lot of different ways in terms of traveling or feeling safe in different locations, feeling safe in your car, um, feeling safe in your body, trusting your body. It creates a lot of different things that we don't necessarily associate, because we can just look at it as, I just had a car accident and I'm in this process of recovering. So my point is that it again is like a tapestry of things that can be intertwined mentally, emotionally, physically, that don't always make sense. If you've been dealing with something and you look over your life and it seems that you're having an irrational reaction and you can't see any frame of reference as to why you're thinking what you're thinking or feeling what you're feeling or reacting in the way that you are, it can be because it's not related to this life. It can be something that you have picked up and absorbed through your lineage or from your parents that is creating some difficulty and some pain for you. So doing some inner child work, doing some past life regressions, doing some mental repatterning are some of the ways that you can begin to move through these experiences. So what I want to leave you with is, things like divorce, getting fired from a job, being in an unhealthy relationship are also some common ways that post-traumatic stress symptoms can emerge. If you found yourself questioning why you keep doing certain things that you want to change, if you keep revisiting memories that are creating pain spirals or doing self-harm, it may be a symptom of post-traumatic stress that is worth looking at more deeply so that you can begin to heal mentally, emotionally, physically, and spiritually. So I welcome your comments, and if any of this has resonated with you, I'd love to hear what really landed. Bottom line, I want to reiterate again, is that being able to put two and two together, to recognize some of these symptoms, our minds love to make sense of things, and sometimes it just doesn't. But if you find yourself being triggered, be open to look more deeply at things, because sometimes things don't always make sense, and they don't always follow a logical pattern. When we're dealing with emotions, we're dealing with a lot of illogical reactions. So please share this video with others if it really resonates and if you feel it will benefit others. And I'm going to be talking more about the ups and downs of healing, and I hope that you will join me again. So thank you so much for spending time with me today, and I look forward to being with you again real soon. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Take care.